Welcome to Nailing It Down, a series here at Barn Blog. And today I'm discussing productive and unproductive labor, its uses, its abuses, and what it actually means. Now, you don't have to accept my categories. You could, like Colin Drum did in a video before, say that these categories as used by Marx are based on false conceptions inherited in Marx from Ricardo and Smith's misunderstanding of William Petty. You can accept that, and that makes most of this conversation null and void. However, if you do not, we need to talk about what productive and unproductive labor is. Productive does not mean socially necessary. Productive does not even mean necessarily necessary to capital, nor can you know if labor is productive until it is valorized. And I'm going to go into that in detail, particularly in one writing by Marx, where he makes this very, very clear. But to get into productive and unproductive labor, we do have to necessarily talk about the categories of value, production, wealth, etc. So, productive and unproductive labor is actually crucial to multiple Marxist texts. It comes up in the economic works of Karl Marx in 1861 to 1864, which is notes on capitalist production. It comes up in theories of surplus value. It comes up in Capital's Volume 1, 2, and 3. So today I'm going to focus on some general definitions and go into one of the places where this is most clearly talked about, which is the economic works of Karl Marx, 1861 to 1864, productive and unproductive labor. You know, the thing actually entitled what we're talking about. 1, as Marx states in Critique of the Goethe Program, wealth is not created by labor. Wealth exists in the world whether you use it or not. It is not a social category. You cannot have wealth without things in the world. Now, we can deduce from that there are two kinds of wealth. Social wealth, the wealth created by relations of production, and natural wealth, which is the wealth that just exists in the world. It is not the same to say natural wealth is just use values, or because you have to do something to use that wealth. You can have the wealth and not use it. And if you don't use it, it has no use value to you. So that brings us to another category, use value. Use value is a value, subjective or objective, that we get from something that we use. This has no quantifiable apparatus, right? There's no abstract labor, which is labor counted and monetized here. Use value is, I like the soda, so I drink it. What did I get from that? There's no abstract quantification other than my own individual satisfaction. Then there is value, or sometimes called abstract value, or surplus value. Surplus value comes from counting labor and selling the labor, and counting the product and selling the product. And the difference between them is where the surplus is generated. It's very basic, very clear. It is created in the act of work, but not just any labor creates it. And that creation cannot be known until it is valorized. To separate creation from valorization is to make value, abstract value, metaphysical. As if any work you did just bestowed economic value upon an object. That's not the case. Now, both in Das Kapital and in theories of surplus value, Marx talks a lot about productive and unproductive labor. But this comes from Adam Smith, and we need to understand this first. This specifically comes from Book 2, Chapter 3 of the wealth of nations. There is one sort of labor which adds value of the subject upon which it is bestowed, and there is another which has no such effect. The former, as it produces a value, might be called productive. The latter, unproductive labor. Thus, the labor of a manufacturer adds generally to the value of materials he works upon, and that of his own maintenance, and of his master's profit. Manufacturer here means maker or worker, doesn't mean company. The labor of the menial servant, on the contrary, adds value of nothing, though the manufacturer has his wages advanced to him by his master. In reality, the cost costs him no expense, the value of those wages being generated and restored, together with a profit and improved value upon the subject of which his laborer is bestowed. But the maintenance of menial servant is never restored. A man grows rich by employing a multitude of manufacturers. He grows poor by maintaining a multitude of menial servants. The labor of the latter, however, has its value and deserves its reward as well. Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations. This is what many Marxists think Marx means by productive and unproductive labor. But it is not what he means. So we've already established that wealth is not the same as value. Value is a social category. It is either manifested in its use or its abstraction on the market. 2, human wealth is a social relation. 3, wealth and economic value are not the same thing. Value is purely a social category again, and it has social attributes. 1, work is not naturally productive, both in the sense that it takes work to make work productive, and that productive work depends on the tools and techniques to be productive. Does it actually adhere within socially necessary labor time? Is it actually an efficient use of time? 2, a worker is economically productive and a source of additional wealth to his employer, insofar as they can produce more than is required for their own subsistence, and thus adding to the surplus product. Now, this applies before capitalism, actually. So surplus production is just done by any time you have surplus product of your labor. So when you move from subsistence to non-subsistence, this is what you're doing. The definition of productive and unproductive labor is specific to each type of society and is dependent on the given relations of production. So the above general rule is going to be different in each society because of the relations underneath it. 3, there is no neutral definition of productive and unproductive labor. Who is productive from the point of view of one class may not be productive from the point of view of another. So the bourgeois definitely see themselves as productive, but they're not productive from the standpoint of the worker. The objective definition of productive labor, then, is what matters within the conditions of the mode of production. From the point of view of the capitalist class, labor is productive if it increases the private value of capital or results in private capital accumulation, i.e., does it lead to private profits? We're not talking about national debt accounting here. Thus, productivity is productivity to the capitalist surplus that's understood in general as manifested in private profits. Capitalistically productive labor is therefore adds to the mass surplus value, both profitably producing goods and services for market sale, because services can be traded as a commodity. This is different from Adam Smith already. No new value is created through the act of exchange only. Right? I want you to understand that. And I'm not saying that it is when I say valorization and creation happen coterminously, but you can't have one without the other. It's not just selling stuff in the market that creates value. Labor facilitates exchange is productive from the employer's point of view, but it's unproductive from the point of view of the general society, as it is only a transfer of wealth. Thus, unproductive labor is accepted because it reduces the cost of capital accumulation or facilitates it. The definition of productive and unproductive labor is not static. In the course of capitalist development, division labor is increasingly modified, and more labor is productive in the capitalistic sense, for example, through marketization, privatization, value management, increased efficiency or decrease of socially necessary labor time through automation, and Taylorist productive management. Anything that drops the socially necessary labor time can raise the value and lead to more exploitation. In other words, the more efficient worker is actually the more exploited worker from the standpoint of this definition. Whether work has been productive or unproductive can really only be known after the fact in a capitalist society, because commodity producing labor in most cases is valued by the market only after it has been performed, when the product, a good or a service, is exchanged and paid for. Thus, according to Marx, there are 10 distinctions relevant to defining productive labor in a capitalist mode of production. This doesn't deal with non-capitalist modes of production either. Commodity production versus other production. Does it produce something you can trade? Capitalist production versus non-capitalist production. Is it production for something that has pre-capital values? Is not trying to generate abstract surplus labor from abstract labor in the form of surplus value. All right. Abstract labor is the counting of man hours and the accounting of all this. Accounting is crucial. Production versus circulation. Production for profit versus production that does not have a profit. Production of use values versus production of exchange values. Production of value versus the appropriation of revenue. So, are you making value or are you taking rents? And the production of income versus the distribution of income. In most cases, it would be obvious whether labor was capitalistically productive or not, but in some cases it would not be clear even according to Marx, and I think we should understand that. According to Marx in Capital Volume 2, if we have a function which, although in and for itself unproductive, it nevertheless is a necessary moment of economic reproduction, then this is transformed through the division of labor to a secondary activity into the main exclusive activity of a few, into their special business. This does not change the character of the function itself. So, if labor is purely about the maintenance of class-based social order, such as the legal system, police, the military, and the government, it is unproductive. And he actually uses this example in the case of a teacher. When the teacher works for a private corporation and produces a profit for a private corporation, even if that corporation is a school, the teacher is productive to the general surplus. But if he works for the government, the teacher is not, or she is not, or they are not. The maintenance and security of property relations is tolerated, such as police, the legal system, banking, accounting. This is not productive. It might be necessary, but it's not productive to the general surplus. Insurance and safety, again, necessary for the functioning of markets, but not productive to the general surplus. And criminal activity. And that one's a bit questionable, because gray market is sometimes productive, and as I've talked about before. Although these are a cost to capital society, they still might be worth doing. All right? So unproductive does not mean socially unnecessary. It does not mean socially unnecessary even in terms of capital. And it definitely does not mean good or bad. Producing fentanyl in mass amounts is productive to the surplus labor traded on the capitalist market. It's not good. All right. This is also an interesting thing from Das Kapital Volume 1. The laborer alone is productive, who produces surplus value for the capitalist, and thus works for the valorization of capital. Now, I think this is interesting. All right. Valorization here is often seen as distinct as value creation. All right. But it's often translated as self-expanded value or the creation of surplus value. So the distinction, the hard distinction many people want to put between the creation of value and the valorization of value doesn't hold very well, all right? Because you cannot know if something produces value, not use value, but value in the abstract, until it is valorized. So while it is dependent on the labor happening, you cannot do it without labor. And I'll get into why in a few minutes. The valorization is when you realize the creation of value. And separating them is almost impossible to do. It is even difficulty in the word in German itself. Capital Verwertung. All right, and Verwertung has multiple meanings in German. Now, to go into this in more detail, I'm going to look at the specific section on this in the economic works of Karl Marx of 1881 to 1884. Productive and unproductive labor. This is a quotation written by Marx on a number sheet, so it's just put in there. And I'm going to let you follow along with me so you can see what I'm reading and know that I'm not misrepresenting it. Here, we should likely brief to anticipate our results before we consider any further the changed shape of capital which emerges from the result of capitalist mode of production. Since the direct purpose and actual product of capitalist production is surplus value, that's what we generally call value, by the way. Only such labor is productive, and only to such an exerter of labor capacity is a productive worker, as it directly produces surplus value. Hence, such labor is productive as it is consumed directly in the production process for the purpose of valorizing capital. Notice that valorizing and creating capital can almost be simultaneously used. From the simple standpoint of the labor process in general, and such a labor appeared to be productive as was realized in the product, or more precisely in the commodity. But from the standpoint of the capitalist production process, this element has to be added to the definition. Such labor is productive as it directly valorizes capital, or produces surplus value, and hence is realized without any equivalent for the worker, for the performer of the laborer, in surplus value, expressed in surplus produce. Hence, in the excess increment of commodities for the monopolizer of the means of labor, for the capitalist, only labor is productive as it posits the variable capital. Variable capital is work. Fixed capital is things like automation, fixed cost. And therefore the total capital as C plus prime C equals C plus prime V. Excuse me. That's not prime. That's delta. Yeah, that's delta, excuse me. C plus delta C equals C plus delta V. It is therefore labor which directly serves as capital as the agency of its self-valorization, self-creation, as a means of production of surplus value. The capitalist labor process does not abolish the general determinations of labor process. It produces products and commodities. To that extent, such labor remains productive as objectified in commodities as a unity of use and exchange values. This is where surplus value comes from. They are unified. But the labor process is only a means to capital's valorization process, and such labor is productive as it is represented in commodities. But we consider individual commodities, such labor is productive as it represents unpaid labor and alcohol part of the commodity, or if we consider the total product, such labor is productive as it represents nothing but unpaid labor and alcohol as part of the total quantity of commodities, hence presents a product which costs the capitalist nothing. Meaning that the capitalist is making more off of someone else's labor, and thus the cost of labor is not actually costing them anything from their own general surplus and accumulation of wealth. The worker is productive who performs productive labor, and labor is productive, which directly creates surplus value, i.e. valorizes capital. Notice creates and valorizes here are used interchangeably. For those who want to make a strong distinction, the actual wording here makes that distinction hard to maintain. Only in the narrow-minded bourgeois, who regard the capitalist form of production as an absolute form, hence as a sole natural form of production, confuse the question of what are productive laborers and productive workers from the standpoint of capital with the question of what is productive labor in general. A lot of Marxists do this too, and therefore can be satisfied with the tautological answer that all labor is productive which produces, with the result in a product or any kind of use value which has any result at all. The worker alone is productive whose labor process equals the process of the productive consumptive capacity of labor, a dividical of labor by capital of the capitalist. Two things immediately flow from this. Firstly, since the development of the real subsumption of labor under capital, or specifically capitalist mode of production, is not an individual worker, but rather a socially combined labor capacity that is more and more the real executor of the labor process as a whole, and since the different labor capacities who cooperate together to form a productive machine as a whole contribute in a different way to the direct process by which the commodity, or more appropriate here, the product, is formed, one working more with his hands, the other working more with his brain, one as a manager, an engineer, or a technician, another an overlooker, the third directly as a manual laborer, or even a mere assistant, and more the function of labor capacity are included under the direct concept of productive labor. By the way, did you just notice that manager, engineer, and overlooker are part of the productive labor process as stated here in Marx? So a lot of you who are inventing categories based on productive labor are ignoring what the text says and are using Adam Smith's definition of productive labor, not Marx's. If one considers the total worker constituting the workshop as its combined activities directly realized in the material and the total product, which is at the same time the total quantity of commodities in connection, is a matter of the complete indifference of what the function of the individual worker. Notice here, the complete indifference of the function of the individual worker, who is only a constituent element of the total worker, which is the total worker in the process, all the workers in the process together, as understood as an individual unit, stands closer to direct manual labor or far away from it. But then the activity of the total labor capacity in direct productive consumption by capital, a capital's process of self-valorization, the direct production of surplus value, and therefore a point which we develop further on, the direct conversion of surplus value into capital. So, 1, the separation of creation of value, which requires labor to happen, because labor is according to Marx, a variable form of capital. Fixed capital plus competition will drive profits down to nothing. Variable capital is variable. You can make it more efficient by re-efficienting organizations. You can also reduce socially necessary labor time to make machines better, but eventually, if you just have machines, there will be nothing to exploit. All right. Secondly, it is not your part in the labor process that determines whether or not you are productive. All right? Whether or not a man works with his hands or with his mere brain is irrelevant to this distinction. Marx clearly states that, unambiguously states that. Third, valorization and the creation are intimately related. You cannot know if value has been created until it has been valorized, thus self-actualized in Hegelian parlance. All right, let's continue. Secondly, the more determinist of the productive labors follows automatically, given the characteristic feature of the capitalist production process. Firstly, in confronting capital or the capitalist, the owner of labor capacity figures either as a seller, irrationally expressed as we have seen, or as a direct seller of living labor, not of a commodity. He is a wage laborer. This is the first presumption. Secondly, however, this preliminary process, which belongs to the circulation, introduces a stage by which the worker's labor capacity and his labor are directly incorporated into the capital's production process as a living factor. Labor capacity itself becomes one's capital component, its variable component, in fact, hence why labor is the form of variable capital, which not only preserves in part, but also reproduces in part the capital values which have been advanced, but at the same time increases them, therefore converts them into a self-valorizing, i.e. creating, form of value into capital, and for the first time through the creation of surplus value. This labor directly objectifies itself during the production process as a quantity of value in flux. The first condition may occur without the second. A worker may be a wage laborer, a day laborer. This always takes place, even if the second moment is absent. Every productive worker is a wage laborer. This does not mean that every wage laborer is a productive worker. In all cases where the labor is bought in order to be consumed as use value, as a service, and not in order to replace the value of variable capital as a living factor, it needs to be incorporated into the capitalist production process. This labor is not productive labor, and the wage laborer is not a productive worker. His labor is then consumed on the account of its use value, not positing exchange value. This gets complicated when we talk about the exchange of services on the open market. Abstractly, that's where things get more complicated now, but it is here. All right. Of use value, but not as positing an exchange value. It is consumed unproductively, not productively. The capitalist does not confront the laborer as a capitalist, as a representative of capital. He exchanges his money for the labor as income, not as capital. The consumption of the labor does not constitute the MCM, but the CMC. The last symbol represents the labor or the service itself. Money functions here only as a means of circulation, not as capital itself. Itself is bad by me. The commodities the capitalist buy for his private consumption are not consumed productively. They do not become factors of capital. Just as little do services he buys for his consumption voluntarily or through compulsion from the state for the sake of their use value. They do not become a factor of capital. They are therefore not the productive kind of labor, and who performs them are not productive workers. The more production in general develops in the production of commodities, the more everyone has to become or wants to become a dealer in commodities and maker of money out of his product or his services if that product only exists in the forms of a service owing to the way it is naturally constituted. This money making appears as the ultimate purpose of every kind of activity. See Aristotle. And capitalist production, the production of products as commodities on one hand and the form of labor as wage labor on the other, becomes absolute. A large number of functions and activities were surrendered with a halo, regarded in the ends of themselves, and done for nothing are paid for in indirect ways, such as professionals as physicians and barristers and ingers could not sue for payment. It's not true anymore, by the way. Are on one hand directly converted into wage labor. However, their content or their mode of payment may differ, meaning there's no distinction between hourly and salary, despite what people might tell you. On one hand, they become the subject, that is the estimation of their value, the price of their various activities. From the prostitutes to the kings become subject to the laws that regulate the price of wage labor. The analysis of this latter points to there being a special discussion of wage labor and wages, rather than to this section. This phenomenon, that with the development of capitalist production, all services are converted into wage labor, and all those who perform these services are converted into wage laborers, hence, they have this characteristic in common with a productive worker. Even more grounds for confusing the two, and that it is a phenomenon which characterizes and is created by the capitalist production itself. On the other hand, it gives the apologists of capitalism an opportunity to convert the productive worker, because he is a wage laborer, into the worker who merely exchanges his services, i.e. labor as use value, for money. This makes it easy to pass over in silence the differentia specifica of the productive worker and of capitalist production. As a production of surplus value, as a production of a self-valorizing capital, which incorporates the living labor as merely its agency. A soldier is a wage labor, a soldier is a wage laborer, a mercenary, but he is not for the reason a productive worker. A further error has two sources. Firstly, some labor which produces commodities and capitalist production is performed in a manner which belongs to earlier modes of production, with relations of capital and wage labor does not yet exist in practice, and therefore the category of productive and unproductive labor, which corresponds to the capitalist standpoint is entirely inapplicable. So there's lots of stuff that this doesn't even apply to, according to Marx. But in accordance with the ruling mode of production, even those relations which have not yet been subsumed, and in fact are subsumed under it notionally. The self-employed laborer, for example, is his own wage laborer, and his own means of production confront him in his own mind as capital. As a capitalist, he employs himself as a wage laborer. Anomalies of this type often favor fields for outpouring of dribble about productive and unproductive labor. Secondly, certain unproductive kinds of labor may incidentally be connected with the production process, and their price may even enter to the price of the commodity. Hence, the money laid out for them so far form a part of the capital advance, and their labor may appear as a labor which is exchanged not for income, but directly for capital. Let us straightaway take the last case, taxes, the price of government services. But this belongs to the full fry day of production, the overhead cost of production. It is a form accidental to the capitalist production process in and of itself, and is no way conditioned by it, are necessary or imminent in it. For all indirect taxes are converted to direct ones, taxes would continue to be paid, but they would no longer form a capital advance rather than expenditure of income. The possibility of this exchange and the form of its external character and its indifference to and contingency for the capitalist production process with the exchange and form of productive labor. In contrast, the income of the capital would dry up and capital itself would cease to exist. For examples are legal proceedings, contracts, etc. All these relate only to the conditions made of the owners of commodities as buyers and sellers of commodities and have nothing to do with the relations of capital and labor. Those who perform these functions therefore become wage laborers of capital. That does not make them productive workers. I also want to point out that he doesn't say productive workers or proletariat are exactly the same thing. Productive labor is only an abbreviated expression for the whole relation, and the manner in which the labor capacity and labor figure is in the capitalist production process. Hence, if we speak of productive labor, we speak of socially determined labor. Labor, which implies a very definite relation between the buyer and a seller. Productive labor is exchanged directly for money as capital, for money which is in itself capital, has a quality of functioning as capital, and confronts labor as the capacity as capital. Productive labor is therefore labor which for the worker only reproduces the previously positive value of his labor capacity. But as value creating activity, it valorizes capital and contraposes these values created by labor to the worker as himself as capital. Specific relation has been objectified and living labor, which makes the former capital and the later productive labor. The specific product of capitalist production process, surplus value, is only created through the exchange with productive labor. What forms its very specific value for capital is not its particular useful character any more than its particular useful qualities of the product in which it is objectified. It is its character as an element which creates exchange value, aka surplus value. The specific product of the capitalist production, surplus value, is only created through exchange with productive labor. What forms its specific use value for capital is not its particular useful character any more than it is its particular useful quantities of the product in which it is objectified, but its character as an element which creates exchange value. The capitalist production process is not merely a process of the production of commodities. It is a process which absorbs unpaid labor, making the means of production into a means of absorption of unpaid labor. It emerges from what has been said so far to be productive labor, and the quantity of labor in and for itself has absolutely nothing to do with the particular content of the labor, its particular usefulness, or its specific use value in which it is expressed. Labor with the same content that therefore be both productive and unproductive depending on the context. That last bit is me. Milton, for example, who did Paradise Lost, was an unproductive worker. In contrast to this, the worker who delivers hack work for his publisher is a productive worker. Milton produced Paradise Lost in a way that silkworm produces silk, as an expression of his own nature. Later on, he sold the product for £5, and to that extent, he became a dealer in a commodity. But the Leipzig Literary Proletarian produces books, i.e. compendia of political economy, at the instructions of his publisher, who is roughly speaking a productive worker, insofar as his production is subsumed under capital and only takes place for the purpose of the later's valorization. Notice that This is not about what you do or whether or not you're a mental or physical worker. It's about whether or not you produce surplus value for a private entity. It is not even whether or not you produce a physical commodity. A singer who sings like a bird is an unproductive worker. If she sells her singing for money, she is to an extent a wage laborer or commodity dealer. But the same singer, when engaged by an entrepreneur who has her singing in order to make money, is a productive worker, for she directly produces capital. A schoolmaster who educates others is not a productive worker, but a schoolmaster who is engaged as a wage laborer in an institution along with others in order through his labor to valorize the money of an entrepreneur through a knowledge-mongering institution is a productive worker. Yet most of these kinds of work, from the formal point of view, are hardly subsumed formally under capital. They belong among rather transitional forms. This is why it is so hard to talk about who is not a productive laborer, because it can only be understood once capital is valorized for private profits. And since the valorization of capital for private profits is increasingly tied up in all kinds of other distinctions, talking about broad sectors of the working class as not productive when they do clearly produce self-valorizing commodities is useless. So people who try to use the unproductive versus productive distinction, not to distinguish between, who's actually producing surplus for capital, but to distinguish between the type of workers you should support, is misusing the category. Because we as socialists should not care about such things, all of which are wage laborers and part of the general class. Now, it is underdetermined whether or not they are proletarians. What defines proletarianness? The lack of relations of property. That you are exploited, part of the working class, and that you do not have productive capital. But there are whole swaths of people who are not in either of those categories. Now, the wage production is generalized to all of society. We talk about that all the time. There's all kinds of people dependent on the general wage fund. Are they productive? No, not all of them. Nor is this geographically particularly clear where these divisions are, because the cycle of production is spread out over nations now, not just in them. And many of the exploitation and domination of the developing world comes through keeping them from being as productive as they could be, and thus competing with the bourgeoisie of developed capitalist nations, not of competing against workers in those nations. Links in the show notes. I hope you learned something.